Good morning, everybody. That's what I was just thinking. Good morning, everybody. How are y'all? If you were at the trunk or treat yesterday, raise your hand for me. All right. For those that were not there, we had apparently a record number of attendees. Is that right? I heard we had 25 cars, which is a good reflection of how many folks are packed in those cars. And it was so generous of Ralph Oppie to give away his Porsche last night. I mean, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do with a Porsche, but I mean, it's only a two-seater. I got 2 kids. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. All right, for those that are here, thank you for being here. Those that are watching online, I'm able to log on Mondays and Tuesdays to get my sermons and rip those off and put them wherever I put them, and to be able to see who's watching online live and who's watching after the fact and where you're watching from and what you're watching on is a good kind of thing. So it's definitely being utilized. So I want to appreciate those guys in that little blocked out room back there for all the work that they do. And we're picking up this week in Mark. Wrong one. Chapter 14. So how many chapters are in the book of Mark? 16. And I have mentioned time and time again how we have a little bit of controversy, if you want to use that word. It's one of my favorite words talking about the Bible. When looking at the last half of Mark chapter 16, and basically whether or not it should be in our Bible. So I've mentioned that a couple of times to you. The discrepancy is the fact that we've got a bunch of manuscripts and copies of it from the Middle Ages, so the medieval period, literally, in which the end of Mark 16 is there. The problem arises when you look at the oldest 3 copies that we have that are from the 3rd and 4th century, and it's not present. And so people that use that translation theory called the Westcott-Hort translation theory don't think it should be a part of the Bible. And there's a couple of sections like that in the gospel accounts especially. The woman caught in adultery and Christ was just writing in the dirt something. We don't know what it was. Whoever, is without sin cast the first stone. That's not in there either. And so we have a question on our brains, is that a part of the Bible or not? And so before we get to chapter 16, I believe next week or so, we'll play the Bible Project video once again and get his interpretation of how it should be rendered at the very end. And then we'll have some discussion on that. So feel free to input your opinion when it's necessary. Okay? Is that clear to you? Okay? All right, so Mark chapter 14, we covered verses 1 through 2, and then we went on through verses 3 through 9, if I'm not mistaken. We talked about the inference of verse 8, she has done what she could, the woman who sacrificed her costly oil to anoint Jesus before his burial, not probably knowing that that's what he was going to take away from that situation. And then verse 9, and truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. I made the comment that I usually do when I read this verse, that we're still talking about her even today. And so the idea of that sacrifice not being taken and sold for 100 denarii or 300 denarii, but instead being used for Christ because he was present. And so do we have any more comments or thoughts about that particular section, verses 3 through 9 this morning? If we had any comments from last week that we had to put pause on, I want to give you the opportunity to speak now or forever hold your peace. Which, by the way, I never say that during a wedding because you don't know what you're going to get. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Just kidding. I got a script up here, so y'all be quiet. It's my usual wedding thing. Okay, so verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, in case you forgot, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. Now, there's a whole lot of thought around what was in the mind and heart of Judas Iscariot. I've heard some interesting theories over the years, and I want to share one of those with you. And I think it maybe holds some water. We don't have a verse to back it up, so it is what it is, just one of those opinion things. But it's an interesting thought anyway. So verse 11, when they heard it, the chief priests, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. So before we kind of roll on with the text as Mark intends, let's talk about Judas a little bit. So what do we know about him? He was the treasurer. Okay, so he was the one who had the money bags, literally. He's a thief. Yeah, he would take things in the money bag as if the Son of God wouldn't notice. I suppose. I wonder how far he got down that rabbit hole of taking money from the treasury before he realized that he could know the hearts of people and therefore know the heart of Judas Iscariot. Right? So he was a treasurer, he was the money bag guy, he was a thief. What else? Okay, double-minded. I love that Greek word. As you all know, I don't know a whole lot of Greek, but enough I know I'm dangerous with. And that one is literally double psyche, if you want to use the transliterated word of it. Was he a psycho? We're all psychos, literally. According to the Greek, we all have psychopathic tendencies. But yep. Yeah, I like almost all of that sentence. Some of that's a bit vague to me when it comes to the devil entered him. If you think about it in a more literal sense, you have, remember Peter a little while ago? Who do people say that I am? Oh, well, you're John, or you're a prophet. Well, who do you say that I am? Peter knocked it out of the park. If you just swing at every pitch that's thrown to you, sooner or later you get a home run, right? And that was a home run for him. And he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He goes, yeah, you got that right, basically, to paraphrase Jesus in a non-reverent way. And then at the very next part, Jesus goes and kind of explains in a bit more detail, hey, when we go to Jerusalem, these things are going to happen. I'll be betrayed by one of you guys. And then I'll be going to trial, and I'll be killed, and I'll be buried. And then 3 days later, I'll be resurrected. And then what did Peter do? He rebuked him. I wouldn't rebuke Jesus if I were me. I wouldn't think. Maybe it's possible. But Peter rebukes him, saying, these things are going to happen to you, Lord. Meaning, we'll defend you, I suppose. And then Christ says, what? Get behind me, Satan, talking to Peter. And so, yes, the devil, the Satan, the enemy, the adversary, literally entered Judas. Maybe in a way, I'll just say that to be fair. A weak man? In what way? I did. I read it. Well, you mean weak in what? Moral standing? Yeah. Okay.
Spiritually.
Yes.
Sure. Maybe.
I think he was their friend. You hate to think it like that, but he was. He was one of them.
He was one of the 12. Pretty elite group of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't coming from a background of being highly educated or any of that, but they were walking literally, for Mark's account, about a year, but for everybody else, about 3.5 years worth of living with Jesus. That's going to be pretty important, to say the least. What else do we know about Judas?
Where was he from?
It's a good question. Was that a treasurer? Okay, he was. No, he does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just thought that.
Whenever I say that's a good question, it means I don't know. Okay. So y'all know whenever I say comments questions, it means I want to sip of my drink real quick. Y'all know that already. And then when I say, that's a good question, I have no idea.
He was picked for his job, let's say.
Well,
I don't think it was a surprise at the very end. Judas did what he did.
Okay, so you're saying he was picked to be the treasurer, or the job of being a disciple?
God uses everything for his purpose. He did Pharaoh,
Yeah,
he did Moses,
yeah.
he did Judas.
So was it,
But he didn't take someone against his character.
was there a prophecy about someone betraying the Lord?
Yes.
Oh, there was, wasn't there? So you have David, right, writing a psalm, and he's talking about how someone that dined with him at his own table, who he would share the food with, would betray David, and that was used kind of as a prophetic way. So I talked about how after we're done with this, we'll take a couple of weeks to do some random stuff, and then we'll go on to minor prophets. And the prophets always wrote to the audience to which they wrote, which is not a surprise to you. But then also the prophets' writings, there is a little bit of echo of something kind of in the future that may be significant later, which we have the benefit of hindsight and looking back at it and say, oh, okay, so yeah, Malachi was talking about how in his day there was going to be a major prophet speaking against the kings and the nations, and that was Malachi. But also there's this echo of an Elijah coming, and that would be eventually, we know as John the Baptist. Right? So that was the prophecy of what John the Baptist and his role in ministry was talked about 400 years before he was ever born. And so the same thing with David. He wrote about people that he trusted and he fed and he took care of in his own household that betrayed him. I mean, thinking about Saul, thinking about Absalom, for example, like his own son betraying him and kicking him out of Jerusalem and taking his wives. Pretty big deal. But also there's this echo of, it seems like there's something for the Messiah in there too. And then, of course, you have Jesus later explaining, hey, that prophecy from David, that's talking about this guy over here. So one more thing of importance, in my mind anyway, about the life of Judas. What else do we know about him? He did. The end of Judas, it was abrupt. Just say that much, right? Now, contrast that to someone who was prophesied that before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Who was that? Peter. And when he regretted his decision, he eventually got restoration and forgiveness from the Lord after he was resurrected, in contrast to Judas, who couldn't take that restoration and forgiveness, and he killed himself. So, anyway. So, again, we are Mark chapter 14. And we just read verses 10 and 11, and that was Judas now looking for an opportunity to betray the Lord. And then we go on to verse 12. Now, we never talk about, we, meaning me, Mark's version of the Passover that became the Lord's Supper, because it's kind of a shorter version of what we find in Matthew and in Luke and 1 Corinthians, right? So it's not as detailed, but it still is in here, which I mentioned because when you're reading Mark, we know who John Mark is. We know that it's possible, at the very least, that when you read John Mark, maybe you're not really reading John Mark's words. You're reading whose words? Peter's. So he was with Peter in Rome, so it seems like maybe this is more Peter's version of the events. It's possible, and it doesn't really matter for the text, but it is possible. It's an interesting kind of connection there to make. And then we also know the recipients of Mark's gospel were primarily for who first? Romans, right? And so there were folks that were likely Gentiles, and they were in Rome, and they were reading this, and there were some things explained at the very beginning of our study in which we find some words that were in Aramaic that were translated to Koine Greek. And you wouldn't really need that if you already spoke Aramaic like all the Jews in the region did. And so it seems like that seems to indicate to us that Mark is writing for an audience that doesn't really know Aramaic, because why would you if you're in Rome? No one speaks that. So that's a thought for us. So when we're reading things in Mark and we're taking it from that full perspective of the author and the recipients, and especially the date as well, the things that are included, that are a part of the synoptic gospels, are interesting because Matthew goes into more detail, as does Luke, but Mark doesn't, right? So just a real quick refresher. What's the synoptic gospel? What's that? Matthew, Mark, well, close. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So synoptic, to see the things from the same perspective, essentially, is a kind of a way that we can say that in English to make more sense. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all pretty much the same thing with varying degrees of details, for example. And then you got John, right? I talk about John a lot because he's just out there. He's an old guy, does what he wants to do. He just writes John, and he starts at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, right? So, verse 12. And on the first day of unleavened bread, let's pause there. What's unleavened bread in this context? Sorry? Okay, without yeast, literally, but what's Mark trying to indicate to us? Passover is getting real close. Not quite there yet, but it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is what we would call it in its full title, right? So you can go back to Exodus or Deuteronomy and see more detail about that if you so wish. If you've got a study Bible, either in your hands or on your device, that's very helpful to kind of be clear about what's being said. I mean, I still use study Bibles to this day to make sure I'm not totally coming out of left field. I go there anyway, but here we are. So the idea of like unleavened bread, what's that? It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and here's where it's recorded in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Here's the purpose. So you're prepping for the Passover, right? And when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, so now we are fully into the Passover, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" So it seems to indicate, because it totally does, that they would keep the Passover meal, right? So who was supposed to keep the Passover meal? Jews. Okay, that's good. Was Jesus a Jew? He was. Okay. So some folks are really thrown off by that statement. If you don't know that already, then now you know. They think that he was the first Christian, which, if you want to get technical, he kind of wasn't, right? I mean, it's hard to be a follower of Christ when you are the Christ, I suppose. So anyway, just got to be aware that some folks are really thrown off by the fact that he was a Jew. I've had slight disagreements with people over the years in my confined context of being in my little Nissan Sentra driving strangers around Charleston for 3 years. And they are fully convinced that he was the first Christian. He was never Jewish. Not sure why it's a hang-up for some folks, but some folks are taught incorrectly and have a wrong understanding. So be patient with those folks and we'll see where we get. Okay, so why was it so important that they find a place to celebrate the Passover meal? Well, what's the issue at the end of verse 12? Why is the question there?
Follow the laws of the Jews.
Okay, that's true.
They're still following the law.
They are.
And the law was that you celebrated the Passover and the Passover meal.
That's right. But why do they have to ask where you want to go?
They didn't have a place.
There we go. Yeah. They didn't have a home, right? They didn't have a home base. They had Caesarea Philippi, where they kind of launched out to do their mission work, we might call it. They had Mary, Martha, and Lazarus that were present, and they could borrow their place, I guess. But there was a very important question, okay, where do we go for this? Because we don't have a place to go. They were homeless. In other words, verse 13, and he sent 2 of his disciples. Who are the 2 disciples sent? The shrug is the right answer. We don't know. So I say that because sometimes we want more details that aren't quite there, and they're a little bit frustrating for us because we want to have more details. But Mark says, no, thank you. Here's the details I give you. 2 of the disciples, and said to them, go into the city, verse 13, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. So again, running water was a luxury, right? It was present, but it was a luxury. So they were going to probably a well. Verse 14, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, which is a huge implication. Anyone know what the implication is? Yeah, there it is. He's a slave. You got a slave going to get water for his master. Follow that slave back home and then talk to the master about it because he's in charge. Okay? It's a Roman world after all. Where are we? Teacher, the teacher, the rabbi, says, "Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. There prepare for us." This guy was prepping a Passover room for folks that didn't have a place to eat the Passover, which is nice of him to do that, right? And it just so happened that the room that he was preparing would be used by Jesus on the last Passover he would ever eat on earth. And so it's an interesting little thing that he was preparing for someone that he didn't know who it was, and it was actually God himself in a body. Okay. Verse 16, "And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it just as he had told them." Well, what a coincidence. Weird that Jesus knew exactly what would happen, right? What's that an example of? The fact that he knows stuff. That's right. That's a proper definition of a prophet. The fact that he knows stuff. As Caitlin says. All right. So he was literally a prophet in the sense that we think of prophecy. If you have a prophet, someone that can foretell the future, right? I want to kind of give you this prep before we get there. A prophet is not just someone who can tell the future, right? The main bulk of their work is someone that foretells a message from God. Right, so that's the bulk of the situation there. Okay. Verse 17, "And when it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they were reclining at table and eating," we'll pause right there. So, are you aware of the dining arrangements in the first century for meals? Everybody is crystal clear? No questions at all? You've got pillows on the floor, low tables. The way we think of dining at around a table today in our modern world, quote unquote, is not what's in scope here. Despite what Da Vinci thought, they were not sitting at one long table and not using the other side of the table, right? It was reclining at small tables. And they would have been broken up into different groups or sections or pods or whatever you want to call it. And so not everyone was at one big table, as Da Vinci would have you imagine. And so the reason why it's so important to mention here before we get to that next little statement is you have Jesus and probably John, because John was his best friend, after all, John says when he's an old guy. And they were sitting together at one particular section of the table. You have other tables that were present, and so not all the disciples were sharing the same table, nor dipping in the same olive oil, the bread that they would have had, which would have been unleavened, obviously. Okay, that's important to kind of know, because Jesus said, verse 18, part B, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." So, of course, the scope is one of the 12. That would be the most obvious interpretation of that. But a more specific interpretation, according to Matthew and Luke, would be someone who's at the same table eating with me at this present time, who's sharing the same olive oil that we have to dip our breads into. Right? So you've been to a restaurant before, I assume. Have you ever gone to an Italian restaurant or anything kind of like that, and they give you olive oil with herbs and stuff inside there, and they give you this bread that you fill yourself up on before the pasta gets there, so you're already stuffed before your main course arrives at the table. So you have the same situation here. We have a bowl of olive oil, and we have maybe some herbs and spices in there, and etc. And then you've got the bread to dip inside the olive oil, because who wants to eat dry bread? Not me. That's why the oil was invented in the first place, right? So, the situation we have right here in the text. And then verse 19, "They began to be sorrowful and to say to one after another, 'Is it I?'" Or is it me, because we're English? Is it me? Am I the one? Now, I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons, but the main thing is they were so doubtful, it seems. They were like, am I the one that does it? Or did I already do it? Am I the guy? And they didn't even know. But there was one guy present who knew, it's totally me. And everyone else is blaming themselves on the situation. He said, "It is one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with me." So, I mean, we know who it is, right? Because, verse 21 or 4, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed." And then this statement, which is curious, "It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." And we don't say that lightly, do we? So we've seen already a case of what we call hyperbole, or hyperbole if you want to say it wrong, like I have for so many years. You have Jesus making a statement that is over the top, for exaggerated effect to make a point, right? If you cause these little ones to stumble, what are you supposed to do? Get a millstone, tie that joker around your neck, and cast yourself into the sea. What's the intended effect of that?
It'd be better for you to do that than to destroy this child.
I mean, don't think Christ is encouraging you to kill yourself by drowning.
Well, how could you know?
Well,
Okay.
I mean, I think God's pretty much opposed to it, so that's a big clue. But yeah, so
Not love. That is not love.
all right. If your right hand offends you, what are you supposed to do? Cut off your hand. Any amputees here this morning for that cause anyway? If your right eye causes you to sin, what are you supposed to do? Pluck it out. I don't see any eye patches quite yet. Maybe you got a glass eye. So there's Jesus using hyperbole to make an effect. It's a bad thing. And what he's trying to say here, I believe, I could be wrong, is talking to Judas specifically. Listen, what you're about to do is a bad thing. It's been prophesied. It's going to happen. You still have volition. You still have free will in the mix because you're choosing to betray the Son of God, and for a cause that we can talk about a little bit later. But it's not good. It's not a good situation for you to be in. Now, could it be, in fact, that he was thinking about the demise of Judas, the suicide that he would commit, and say that end is not as good as if you weren't born in the first place? Maybe. A little conjecture. You don't think so? Yeah. Yeah.
He knew that he would be big for him in the kingdom and spread the gospel. But he also knew that Judas would not be able to repent. He was sorry.
Yeah. So let me clarify. I don't mean that someone that does commit suicide, it would be better for them in all cases to never been born. I'm saying maybe Jesus is being specific to Judas here, saying the one who would betray me, for you in particular, it might have been better if you weren't born because you wouldn't commit suicide, you wouldn't be in the situation. But Jesus did say it. So it's hard to know for sure what he really meant beyond what we have here in the text. So that's not that encouraging. Let's move on to verse 22. How about that? Fair enough? Okay. As they were eating, he took bread. And you kind of know what's coming next because we read it every week, don't we? And after blessing it, which means what? How do you bless bread? Okay, so he said a prayer of what? Thanks. So someone help me out here. I know 2 of the Gospels say bless it, and 2 of it says broke. I thought it was Mark and John said bless, and Matthew and Luke said gave thanks. Someone fact check me because I can't remember for the life of me. I know it's 2 and 2. That's how you know that it means to give thanks, means to bless the bread. And it's not the instance of like standing over it and making a cross shape and all that kind of stuff. It might look good, but it's not really what it means in a literal sense. It's the idea of giving thanks for it. So what does it mean? What's the significance behind giving thanks for the bread? Sure. In this particular verse, this context.
You have someone who's going to be able to represent what that bread represents.
Okay. Yes, that's true.
Just giving an example for us to follow.
Yes. So when you give a Thanksgiving prayer over a meal that you have in your home, for example, assuming that you do, what do you mean by it? What does it mean?
You're thankful for the provisions.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So gratitude for the bread to be available because it's there,
Like
right?
happiness, because blessed means happy.
Right. Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Yes.
I always think of taking a moment to remember God is always meeting all of our needs.
Right. So when you read here that they had bread, and Jesus took the bread, and he gave thanks for it, or he blessed it, it's the idea of him, before we get to the whole Lord's Supper thing, before even that even begins, he's giving thanks for it, for the bread. And he is the body that would be broken. So he's not quite there yet at that stage of the Lord's Supper institution. He's just thankful the bread is present. He's giving thanks for God's provision that they had bread, right? So when we give thanks for the Lord's Supper and the bread, sure, we can have in scope and in mind what the bread represents or what the bread is if you want to be literal about it. We also kind of have God's provision in mind, but I think first and foremost, beginning where Jesus began, he's just thankful that they had bread to use for this meal. And so this is a pet peeve of mine, so take it for what it's worth, which is not a whole lot, it's my opinion. When we give thanks for the bread for the Lord's Supper and the fruit of the vine or the wine, whatever you want to use for phraseology there, just being thankful that we have it is a huge part of the beginning of our conversation about why we're thankful for it. So, of course, keep in mind what it is or what it represents for sure. But just to be thankful that it's present is one part of that. A small part, but a part of that. And the only reason why I kind of harp on that a little bit is because I mentioned to you about Kenya, my trip to Kenya. And that whole work began because they could not afford to have unleavened bread or grape juice for the churches to remember the Lord's Supper. They needed $22 a month for the entire villages that Charles was kind of helping work there to get it from Nairobi. So $22 a month for the entire church to have grape juice was a huge expense. I mean, we're talking about contribution of a financial nature, not just chicken, eggs, and cow meat and that kind of thing. What they gave every first day of the week ended up being like $1 was the most that they could give financially in American money. So that's the entire village. So just kind of keeping that in mind. Okay? Questions, comments about that? Not saying it's wrong to say all that we say. I'm just saying that keep in mind the fact that we are so blessed to have an abundance of specialized unleavened bread and fruit of the vine in little cups is a huge thing, that small thing, but a huge thing that we shouldn't forget that we're blessed to have. Well, I mean, you know.
That's not what you're saying.
The Catholics have a lot of interesting doctrines from which they do not get a lot of it from Scripture. Right. So I think you're hinting towards transubstantiation. Is that where you're going with it?
Well, that's, you can go with that far if you want
I don't want to, Larry. You brought it up.
to.
Okay. Okay. Verse 23. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. So how many cups were there? Sure?
Yeah.
You sure?
Drink of it.
He took a cup,
And they all drank from
and they all drank of it.
What's the it?
The cup.
They drink of the cup?
Yeah.
Think so?
Alcohol.
No, it means literally what it says. They drink of
Yeah.
the cup. So they drank the cup.
They didn't have drinks, so of course.
How do you drink a cup?
There were no Dixie products back then.
Was he using her
grape juice out of
Another
the
version
cup.
says from it. Mine says they all drank from it.
Right?
But
This is a fun debate, y'all.
It's useless.
Useless.
What?
It's hazardous debate.
Oh, no, it's fun. It's
They drank the
important.
liquid out of the cup.
They drank the liquid out of the cup, right? What's the liquid?
Wine.
Wine. Okay, literally oinos is the Greek word for it. It can mean grape juice. I've told you all already, how long does grape juice in the first century world take to become a little bit alcoholic? Literally 1 day from the yeast and the end. So Welch's, why you got Welch's, because you got a guy who figured out how to stop that fermentation process. So you have wine literally used there. We can use grape juice because we have grape juice available. We have the processes to be able to stop the alcoholic version of wine being produced, right? We can stop that whole nonsense, right? So you've got this particular device used in the English and in the Greek in verse 23. They took a cup. The meaning is not the cup. The meaning is the grape juice. But the grape juice was in the container of the cup. Okay? Now, the reason why I bring that whole debate up is because we have a sect of our brotherhood who believes it is sinful if you do what? Use more than one cup because Jesus used only one cup. Now, if you go over to 1 Corinthians, you've got a real big problem because Paul talks about that cup as well. So you have to find the cup that Jesus used at the Passover meal in the upper room. That's the only authorized cup. Sunday morning, you got to ship it FedEx through different time zones all around the world. The reason why I mention that, of course, tongue-in-cheek, is the idea that we have to kind of look a little bit deeper into what's actually being talked about here, because the whole, the process of thinking that gets us to believe we are only authorized to drink from one cup, even post-pandemic in our world, maybe there's some other way to think about that. So maybe we go a little bit crazy for that whole authorized thing every now and again. I'm not going to say much more than that. I'll just leave it there. Y'all can pick it up and do what you want or ignore it completely. Whatever you feel to be the proper expression. Okay, verse 24, here's the point. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant." What's the word covenant mean? Promise, contract, agreement, compromise, even in some sense. The reason why it's so important is because that word covenant is in reference directly to a new covenant being established, right? So he has fulfilled the first and bringing on that better covenant, which is poured out for many. Well, that word many is all-encompassing, it seems. Truly, I say to you, and I've mentioned this whole idea, verily, verily, I say unto you, truly, I say to you, whenever you read that, make your ears perk up. Not sure how that looks literally, but let's pay attention to what's being said, because what he's about to say has a very significant spiritual application behind it. Truly, I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine, oinos, wine, until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Okay, someone tells me what that means, please.
Be in heaven?
In heaven?
We're going to be wrong, so why don't you say?
It could be that the kingdom
Kingdom of
he's
God.
talking about is his kingdom here on earth. the
Okay.
church, And he drinks it anew with us every first day of the week whenever we partake of it.
Okay, so theory one, thought one,
God's kingdom.
is when we are in the kingdom here on this earth, gathering together as the kingdom, as the church, every time that we have the Lord's Supper on Sunday mornings, it seems, then we are drinking it, in a sense, with Jesus with us in the assembly. The second thought, or maybe even theory, would be when it comes time for the kingdom to be here in the fullest sense of what we call heaven, maybe the first thing we do is have some unleavened bread, however that takes place in heaven, and we have some wine to remember how we are a part of that new kingdom. It's possible. If it doesn't happen, then I'll be wrong happily, okay? Because I'll be in heaven. Who cares if I'm right or wrong? So that's one thought. All right, verse 26. And when they had sung a hymn, what's the hymn that they would have sung? From the Jewish Psalms, right? It would be a chant more than a singing like we do with four-part harmony. They went out to the Mount of Olives. Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away." What's that mean, fall away? Leave me. Abandon. Go back to fishing, in Peter's case. I mean, talk about step down. You're walking with Jesus, the Son of God, God in the flesh, the Messiah, the Anointed One, and you think He's going to Jerusalem to get rid of Herod, to kick out the Romans, to reign from Jerusalem, and then, out of nowhere, like He's never told us before in His entire life, He gets betrayed, arrested, crucified, and put into a tomb. And what's Peter do? Goes back to his boat, starts fishing again. I mean, you can only imagine how gut-wrenching it must have been.
Imagine if you were collecting taxes.
Well, yeah. Well, all right, Jews. Sorry, guys. Romans are still here. Don't know what happened. You will all fall away because it is written, "I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not," because you know Peter. I mean, he believed in himself. No lack of self-confidence in Peter's mind, right? Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." He said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. And they were all wrong. So the lesson I pull from this is just one among many, obviously. I mean, when we sign up to live this life and to follow the Son of God, I believe that we all have that zeal when we first start out that says, no matter what happens, I have found the truth, I am following the Lord, I am walking the path, the narrow gate is my gate. And then some things may happen in life that where we eventually stumble and fall and maybe even fall away. So I'll just leave it there for this morning, but the idea of picking yourself up, dusting yourself back off, and getting on the right path to follow our Lord is what Peter did and became Peter, the pillar of the church. He was the guy. He wasn't infallible by any stretch of any imagination, for sure. Paul had to rebuke him publicly because he was having some differences with the Gentiles and the Jews, but you still have Peter becoming who he was. If you have any doubt about that, read 1st and 2nd Peter and see who that man became because he was able to pick himself up, dust himself off, and get back on the path. Okay, questions, comments before that bell scares me. It's alarming every time. All right, so we have a pretty good chunk taken out today. Mark 14, of course, is quite long. We'll make it through chapter 14, Lord willing, next week. We'll get on to chapter 15 and get to maybe his crucifixion. If not, we'll get right up to the cusp. And then the week after that, so 2 weeks from now, we'll watch the Bible Project video again from Mark 16 and then get through half of 16, have some conversation, then we'll move on to the very end of what we think is the end of Mark. Okay? 14:32 is the next one. Okay. Thank you all so much. We'll be dismissed now for about 15 minutes before worship. If you are serving today, prayers and such, please remember to meet us in the back room for a prayer before worship begins.